Okay. And after, now one would think that after the Holocaust horrors, that all this would have been uh, put to the end. But alas, that is not the case. The journals that were there before were just renamed and continued. For example, the Annals of Eugenics was renamed Annals of Human Genetics. Okay, and the Brits were Eugenics Education Society. The Brits went and renamed it after Francis Galton. Okay, and this was in as recently as '89. Okay, and at University College of London, and somehow they thought this name was again, more controversial, so they have renamed it now as Adelphi Genetics Forum. Okay, and the same way you can see in all the Western countries, that have been renamed. And now again, their thinking has been really sterilized now, but there are some fringe elephants that were continuing. And for
Bron,
example, yes,
excuse
please
me,
go.
Bron, just for a second. Uh, are you sharing your screen now?
Oh, I'm sorry. I had to stop that. So I just let me. My mistake. Yeah, I was testing it out. So you should be able to see this now.
Okay, yeah,
Okay.
now we've got it.
Oh
I
yeah.
mean,
Okay.
it's
Got it.
okay if you don't. I just wanted to make sure that
No,
you.
no, no. I wanted to make sure that while I was retesting out, I had stopped it. So thank you for pointing it out.
Okay,
Okay.
go
So
ahead.
these were the societies that were there after the war. They were renamed and continued work. And obviously on more scientific thinking rather than so-called has make believe thinking. So science was put to correct this way, but again the work was continued. And now there were other people who, there's something about Harvard that they were strongly in favor of eugenics. As I had the slide, if those of you with better memories than I do remember, I had a slide comparing Harvard and Princeton, where the who is who were strong proponents of eugenics. And and a Harvard anthropologist was still continued, and even 11 years, how many years after, like uh, 17 years after the end of Second World War, had written a book on origin of races, and still praised the multi-centric origin of human beings. So contrasted. And again, you can see that his cousin went on to become a white supremacist, and there's this. I don't know. His idea was that, okay, if Africa was the cradle, it was only the indifferent kindergarten. Europe and Asia were the principal schools. I mean, so the thinking was absolutely as toxic as one can imagine. And his cousin was, named Carlton Putnam in '61, wrote another tome called Race and Reason, a Yankee view, arguing a scientific basis for white supremacy and continuation of segregation in the United States. And this was made to be a required reading for high school students in Louisiana. Okay. And it was finally the American Psychology Anthropologists Association wrote a book condemning it, type of thing. So and he was and that corresponded with things. So there were a lot of fringe element that continued. And obviously, a lot of you remember this book that was the Malthus doctrine about, so, oh yeah, all the so-called third world people are going to out reproduce us, and food is going to run out. And a biologist at Stanford named Elric, he had traveled to New Delhi, and he was just, totally shocked with the teeming masses of people who were begging. This was in the early '60s. And the dust and the filth. And he had written a book called also. So, and that created real fears. And obviously, names that some of may recognize, that the Green Revolution by John Borlaug, this was before CRISPR and everything else. It just changed the whole thing. And instead of being a net importer, India became an exporter of wheat. Okay. And again, there are
So,
some people.
Bharat, let me back up a little bit. Go back to the Harvard piece. Why does it
Yeah.
surprise you that the folks that went to Harvard didn't have a huge interest in maintaining and promoting eugenics as a group of people that ended up in the State Department, ended up going around the world telling everybody how they were bad and the United States was the best, et cetera, et cetera?
Oh yes, I think no, there is there is an agenda type of thing, but they were not. But to be fair, they were not in majority. And again, in terms of academic freedom, they were allowed to continue. But there were people like Stephen Jay Gould, and Richard Lewontin, and they were there also. So I think this was a minority view type of thing, and I think, and obviously a lot of time it happens that once you are tenured, it's very hard to get rid of you. So I don't want to just say that they were, not they were in majority. Obviously, there were people who are doing some excellent work. So we just do not want to, you know, uh, misinform. Just giving a balanced view type of thing. That there were some fringe people who were there, and at the same time there are other people who were, very, scientifically correct thinking. Okay, so just to present both sides, but obviously, like we know with the quota and other stuff that was there, that the anti-Semitism and some, institutional racism was at the core, just that has to be qualified. But I think, that since this is, I don't want this to be a political class, so we'll just, focus on the science part as we go along more type of thing, and just I threw in some of these things, which is, beyond my expertise and authority, so to speak, and I did not research it from that point of view. Now, on the other side, to counteract the population bomb, some people had the zero population growth movement became popular, and and this was in the early 70s, and even during the Nixon era, they were thinking about, sending intra IUDs devices to India, and there were some. So this was, legit fear at that time that was going on, and there are some other people who are so-called experts on that, and you can just see that they had their own agenda, and there's a guy named Tanton. He had openly embraced eugenics to improving genetic quality of by selective breeding. So even after the end of Second World War, this sort of thing, and I wrote a paper as recently as 75 that passive eugenics should be encouraged, type things. And they had promoted a society for genetic education. So there were a lot of, and on the other side, United Nations had formed a committee and that issued a statement on race. And this is pretty, you can just read it for yourself that, that race is just and this was the core that continued through various academia, anthropology, biology, and all the other learned institutions. Yes, that, basically this is a social construct, and that just marrying somebody outside your clan is not necessarily going to make you all, cause problems. So this was, the universal brotherhood of man was advocated. And now again, at the same time, there were people, this was not all 100% accepted by biologists and anthropologists. There were some people who were reluctant to sign, this, because they just kept saying, yes, this makes sense, but there are still certain differences that need to be addressed, including some well-known, the Huxleys are the who is who of British biology establishment, okay, and one of their, I think this was the third generation Huxley named Julian Huxley, who was reluctant to sign it. Another prominent primatologist was reluctant to sign it. Okay, so there were still, but in general, this was the accepted wisdom in academia. Now, on the other hand, in the 1960s, there was a rich Kentucky businessman who was, obviously independently wealthy businessman named Wycliffe Draper, and he was the descendant of slave owners, really one of the who is who of South, and on his own, he strongly believed in eugenics and racial superiority. So from his own private wealth, he had funded something called the Pioneer Fund. And how many of you have heard about this particular magazine? If anybody has, just speak up type of thing. Anyone?
I think you mentioned it last week, Brad.
Okay, I did mention it. Okay, so that's it. So I'm just thinking, so this was, a strong establishment, and this is continued by variety of experts, and some of these names are either Reginald Gates was a British physician, Henry Garrett was a psychologist, another person who is a biologist. So people from various disciplines, they were not geneticists by training, but so-called self-taught geneticists. And, and so they were writing articles, and this still continues, on the basis of pseudoscience. And this has been carried on by another establishment that you may or may not have heard about, called UNZ Review, UNZ Review. Okay, and this is again interesting that UNZ is a Silicon Valley businessman. Okay, he's a descendant of Ukrainian Jewish family, but he's still, now hear this, he's a Holocaust denier. Okay, and he is, and he publishes this UNZ Review, and this is the sort of right-wing white supremacist podcast and online publication. And at the same time, the big person on that is somebody I don't know how many of you have heard of Steve Saylor. Okay, Steve Saylor is a big white supremacist, and he's a strong contributor in this UNZ Review, and strongly in favor of segregation, eugenics, and and downright white supremacist. And he was sort of and he's a MBA with business degree, and and then somewhere along the line he switched field and became a reporter. And he had written his only one book that he has written, so he switched careers, was during the Obama administration, America's Half-Blood Prince. And he, along with other people, are the big, inspiration for the last president. They were like the intellectual foundations of, of the white supremacy movement. And it kind of came out of the closet. It became. So this just gives you an idea. So all of this I learned from this book written by an English woman named Angela Saini. She had written a book about Superior. So that's the book that I had sent in a reference. Okay, moving back to think that one would think that this compulsory sterilization had ended, but no, alas, that is not the case. A documentary that was well reviewed called Belly of the Beast talks about the reproductive injustice in the California prison system, that until as recently as 2010 or even later, several hundred women were forcefully sterilized in the prison system, coercive sterilization of a lot of Latino and African American women. I think so. And if we wanted to get more stay into the current, there's a movie just came out just this week or this month at least, called Origins, that is based on Isabel Wilkinson's book, Caste, that came out about 3-4 years ago. And at the same time, if you wanted to see how psychiatric care was handled during the Jim Crow era, this was a book that was just reviewed in the New York Times just last week or within the last few days, Madness in the Era of Jim Crow. Okay, and that talks about the asylum somewhere in some place called Crownville, Maryland, about how people were institutionalized and were mistreated. Okay, so these are some of the current things that are in the vogue. Okay, and again, now this is when obviously we're focusing on the science class, and most of you are well familiar with this, but considering that I won't assume everybody is, so this was the classic rise of modern genetics, or so-called molecular biology, as the terminology is now, because you'd see that the departments have been renamed and called molecular biology instead of just biology department. Okay, and this was the classic, the biggest discoveries in 1953 was, this is the famous picture of Watson and Crick. And before that, the founder of modern genetics was Thomas Hunt Morgan, who worked with fruit flies. And he and his students, were the real founders of the start of so-called classical genetics, continuing from from the Mendelian era. And I think that I have shown this slide earlier, but just as a revision, I put it again because I don't want to assume everybody's familiar with. But these are the basic terminology. Phenotype is when we look at somebody, the outward appearance. Genotype is the code, genetic code. Alleles are the form of various DNA code that can be show variation in the code. Homozygotes, it's identical pair. Heterozygous is different, which you inherit from parent. And these are pretty classic, basic genetic terms. And some other terms that we talked about was called polymorphism, which is a genetic variation, different types of codes amongst members of a single species, okay, that occur. And again, at that time, and there are some other more complicated terminology, but which I think for sake of time, we won't get into it. And based on the earliest way of genetic typing which was done through National Geographic, which was called haplogroups, or the group of alleles that can be traceable through ancestry. And this was the earlier work that was done before the so-called next generation analysis, was the word map of DNA. And this is the map of the Y DNA across the world. And one can actually see this was one of the earliest thing of so-called direct-to-consumer genomics that was marketed by the National Geographic, I think probably in the 90s. Okay, before the whole genome was analyzed. And you can, I think I can't focus it more closely on this, but this is, so it tells you as to how the oldest origin was from Africa and gradual migration of human beings took place. I'll have several more slides for that, so don't try to strain your eyes more on it. But this was the classification of the so-called, and the now the mitochondrial DNA, which is a relatively small segment that is inherited from your mother only. And this was discovered back in the, I should say, probably in the 80s, correct me if I'm wrong. And so this is inherited directly from your mom, so you can trace your ancestry on your maternal side. And this was the so-called maternal inheritance that can be traced. So you can see, depending upon, so when you do your 23andMe, you can get both of this information about what your maternal haplogroup is or your father's haplogroup is. Okay, so this was the earliest way National Geographic marketed this kit to people, and this was and they was very successful, and people were quite enthusiastic and made a lot of money for National Geographic. And this is just basic inheritance pattern that we have talked about. Huntington disease that is dominant. If you have it on your in your lineage, you're 100% likely to inherit it. On the other hand, recessive disease such as cystic fibrosis, and the third one is color blindness, which is sex-linked inheritance. Which is again, you inherit, but the females don't get the disease, but only that's why men they only have one copy, so they're much more likely to get color blindness. So it is passed on the female side. So okay, and moving on to further things, the Human Genome Project was proposed in the 1990s, and it took almost a decade or so to complete it. And this was the earlier experiments that were done with DNA cloning, the famous sheep Dolly, and then later on DNA sequences became more and more computer-based and with the more powerful sequencing. And I'm sure all of you have heard the word PCR reaction. This was, obviously, if you read all the crime shows, that has become very common knowledge. And this was discovered while driving in a daze or dream or under the influence of psychedelics, by one of the chemists. And he went on to win the Nobel Prize. And by fragmenting DNA and doing heating and cooling down, the polymerase chain reaction. And this led to the floodgates of doing DNA analysis on the tiniest fragment that can be salvaged from a crime scene. Okay. Now, I think I don't know if we have time to show this, but I'll just show this, go over quickly. This was
So
one
I
of
asked
the
my dad where he wanted to go for his 60th birthday.
We just left the National Theater.
Norway, he said, the land of our ancestors. We drank a pint at Ibsen's favorite pub. We sampled the local fare. We saw the fjords.
I feel like yodeling. Do they yodel?
We got new sweaters. We bonded. It was the trip of a lifetime, Dad said. And so we went to the Hall of Records to trace our family tree. And discovered we were actually Swedish. 2 tickets to Stockholm, please? Let's go.
From visiting old worlds to making new discoveries. Whatever your story is, your City card can help you write it. City, let's get it done.
So this is, people are curious about ancestry. So that goes back to, that's the natural thing about trying to find out roots. And after, with the National Geographic kit that was marketed to the general public, Oprah Winfrey did this and Henry Louis Gates did this, and that just exploded the business of from National Geographic to later on to 23andMe. Okay, so that's where you're getting. Okay, now at the same time, there was another Harvard-based geneticist named Richard Lewontin. Okay, and he based on the genetic analysis and blood group analysis, he had published some reputable work type of thing, and he had analyzed various blood groups, and based on blood protein analysis, they said the most of the variation that was occurred within the group, okay, and as opposed to across the group. So this was trying to put that, after all, and the African origin theory is the solid foundation, and trying to segregate, with hard defined boundaries, just did not make sense. So this was a consensus by this time, was solidifying, at least among the majority of people, that among human population, there are no huge differences that are large enough to support the concept of biological race. And again, the idea that was proposed as in the early 50s, that it was a social construct, was, becoming the mainstream thinking. And this was some of his work. This was the well-respected and highly influential paper that race accounts for less than differences in the diversity. So you can just see how it, sorry, this would be when I try to magnify it, it may be harder to see. So now, again, at that time, he was limited by the technology that this was based on relatively few number of genes. He was able to get data only from, less than a few hundred genes. So his data was limited by the available technology at that time. Okay, and obviously with larger database, the thinking has changed. And we'll get to that in a little bit more. Now, I'm sure all of you remember this book that was very controversial. And the roots, this was the book that was published by a psychologist named Murray and Hairston. Okay, and this was, based on, this was an educational study to decide as to whether early education or preschool teaching made difference in the IQ or psychometrics, as it was called. And that, this was full of huge amount of data. And the predecessor of this book was an article that was published in academic journals by a psychologist named Arthur Jensen. And his term was also that these efforts were not making that dramatic a difference in the IQ testing. Okay, so this was, but overall, this book was, criticized even before the publications. And the claim that was that was a few statements in the book that yes, that the African American community had less inherent intelligence and than average white, and that had created a huge uproar. And obviously, the book was rightly criticized. At the same time, they had also made a statement that the Asian IQ, so he had said about the difference between white and blacks was 15 points, and at the same time, the Asian population had a 3% higher IQ than whites. So, but and so this was, and a huge number of psychologists and geneticists and anthropologists, had written letters criticizing the book. At the same time, there were about a few dozen people who had written editorials and taken out advertisement in favor of this book. So again, this was now, even now, this controversy about intelligence, race, and various ethnic groups has continued. And as we had mentioned earlier, that this becomes like a career-breaking move. So a lot of the scientists, had actually stopped doing any this thing because this was not considered. At the same time, on the other side of the border, a Canadian psychologist, now the statement when people who have read the bulk of this thing, that this was a very qualified statement, and but that again, just like it happened a lot of time, that it was taken, people had read a lot more into it than they claimed. They ever just said this was a qualified statement, so to speak, at the end, when you but the psychology that was there, a book that was proposed by Raston, who was a Canadian psychologist, was he went along on the idea of associating evolution, race, and behavior. And his hypothesis was that people who were growing in more suitable climates around the equator, they did not have to work as hard, to survive. And so that's why one of the things, that's why they did not develop creativeness or more analytical thinking. On the other hand, if you're living in the cold climates, that forced the people who had moved up north to develop more resources, and that led to their ability to get higher intelligence. So that was his hypothesis or thoughts, and he was very vocal about it, that this is the reason, the superiority of the European, people over the people from south or near the equator. So this was, again, so it was that dramatic. So it's kind of, you can just say this is like the rehash of the so-called environmental theory that was in vogue during the Aristotelian era. So his book meant what further, that the colder climate lowered the rate of maturation and even testosterone levels. So this was, one of his ideas. Obviously there was very little true scientific evidence for that. Okay, and then when you get down to, again, what the criteria of measurement of intelligence is again fraught with, a huge controversy as to how you measure IQ, because obviously the idea came in from France in terms of educational achievement, and that was extrapolated dramatically in the Stanford Binet scale. Okay, and at the same time, some of you may have heard about something called the Flynn effect, that compared to previous generation, overall the IQs are improving by a small percentage case as time goes along. And the so-called racial gap that was there probably back in the 30s or 40s is narrowing substantially with the availability of more widespread education and other things. So one cannot just be hardwired to think that. And again, the search for genes for intelligence goes on, and in spite of huge database analysis, people have not been able to narrow it down. And again, there were well-meaning researchers have made attempts, but only finally the data interpretation was not on as solid ground as one would have liked it to be. Okay, and again, these are some of the more recent books. Charles Murray, who we recall, he was one of the authors for bell curve, and he's still in publishing. And this is his recent book on human diversity. Now, again, the racial differences have been relabeled as human diversity. Now, whether it is legitimate to study human diversity or not, that you can make your own judgment on it. But again, so, and that I'll have more to say about it as we go along. And this is a scientist that I mentioned somewhere earlier named Robert Plomin, who had done, genome-wide analysis on twin studies and on intelligence. And and this was this thing that yes, there are subtle differences. They're very small percentage wise, but that does not mean we should not study them. And at the same time, his point was very reasonable, that this should show that we should have more opportunities available for people to catch up, so to speak. And this is another book written by a young PhD student, a young psychology professor, on the genetic lottery. I think she works at Rice University or something. And why it does, again, so these have come into criticism from some sources, but at the same time, I've read both of these books, and they were, not totally wrong, one can say, type thing. So, and so there is, after all, there is some genetic component, however small, for intelligence, and genome-wide studies that there are difference account now, how much difference there is, that depending upon which one you read, whether it is 30% or 50%, or some experts say it may be as high as 80% based on stint studies. So now the science is still not well defined, So but the general consensus that the intelligent quotient is weakly corrected with genetics for children. But as you get older, to teens and adults, there is higher correlation that takes place. So again, so that's just, and again, and based on fMRI studies, there are more studies done about larger brain size, volume, and associated with better cognitive function and abilities. And so there are some, areas of the brain called frontal, temporal, and parietal lobe. There is a volume and intelligence are correlated. And people have done some elegant work on, but this is not a neuroscience class, so I'm not going to get too much into it. Okay. And this is, again, this is a subject that I'm sure all of you are well aware as to why do Jewish community, even though being such a small percentage, have been successful. Okay. And historically emphasized. Now, there are varieties of reasons that have been proposed. Okay. Historical emphasis on learning, gravitation toward urban area, geographic distribution, okay, effect of discrimination, okay, minority status and clannishness, okay, and social capital and expectations, okay. And the one paper that I shared, at least Bruce recalls, that we sent it, but there was a paper that was our hypothesis that is proposed by MIT people as to how some of the genes that are causing some rather rare diseases, which are called lipid storage diseases, called sphingolipids, which are the lipids which have a lot to do with your brain tissue formation and the neuron rewiring. They're a lot more common. And these have been shown in laboratory testing that they may have some indirect benefit for improving connectivity. So this is, so on one hand, the disease can be harmful, but at the same time, they have benefited, with causing better thinking or analytical capacity, type thing. And again, this showed that the migration that took place, like I think we talked earlier about the gene flow of the Jewish community as to starting from the Middle East to migrating to Southern Europe and marrying the local women, and then afterwards, usually marrying amongst a small group, causing the selective, advantage that's taken place. So that's, again, obviously, these are ideas from some of the people who are doing research on multidisciplinary research of neuroscience as well as genetics and looking at population data. That thing. So, but that's, it's the papers are rather complicated and needs a background in multidiscipline. So this is one of the ideology that has been proposed recently. And these are some of the ideas of Robert Plomin And again, for those of you who are more interested, can look at the links. Heritability increases from infancy to perhaps 80%. Now, intelligence captures the genetic effect on diverse cognitive and learning abilities, which correlate 30% on an average, but genetically about 60% or higher. And again, depending upon the spousal correlation. So he's doing a lot of on the twin studies, basically. Okay. And again, unlike psychiatric disorder, it's distributed with a positive and exceptional, and it's a positive eugenic. So on one hand, you can frown upon the idea. On the other hand, there is, this is the fat lady hasn't sung on this yet, is associated. And again, we talked about the varieties of other environmental factors. Because, for example, if you're growing up in a poor neighborhood and you have exposure to lead during childhood, no matter, even if you have good inheritance, you're going to be, compromised, or, that the field is not level right from the beginning. And again, in my other class that I was doing, somebody had asked about the theories of intelligence. And some of the IQ testing that was done earlier was very much based on culture, because asking somebody who got off the boat on Ellis Island to ask about who was the baseball player, or asking to do when they have linguistic difficulties to do IQ testing, was obviously, you're going to, no wonder during the First World War, they classified 80% of fresh new immigrants as morons or having learning disability. And this is the current most theory that is accepted by 3 psychologists. It was published back in the 70s as the varieties of intelligence. They talk about the general intelligence can be classified into fluid intelligence, crystallized memory and learning, visual perception. And you can just see that amongst, if you have more than one child, you can just see that different people have different abilities, even among children with same parents. So this is more or less generally accepted theory right now in psychometrics field. Again, the twin study showed the correlation of heritability as it increases as you get older. So, and this is one of the data from one of the recent papers about the twin studies. And you can see that the numbers are not small. So it increases, as you get older. So again, I'm repeating myself, but I think that's a very interesting or controversial, whichever way you want to interpret subject. Okay. And again, this was, most of you have at least are aware in peripherally, even if you're not about, this was the big announcement of 2 simultaneous studies of the government's, the NIH-sponsored study of the Human Genome Project, and the independent businessman, entrepreneur named Craig Venter, who challenged the NIH to how the human genome should be analyzed. And his idea was that he wanted to patent the genes, but wiser brains prevailed. And both of these papers were simultaneously released. And the idea that genes can be patented for profit by companies, was finally banned. Otherwise, you would have been paying hundreds of dollars for doing testing for breast cancer screening. And there was one of the ideas that was proposed by a company called Myriad Genetics. Okay. Now this is, I think this is a very busy slide, and I think this is only for biology majors, so to speak. And I have a whole sleeve of about 20 slides, but I'm not going to even to show, because otherwise people would get really frustrated with this. But this just summarizes the so-called, on one hand, yes, we accept that there is no such thing as race, but there are variants that still affect as to how, because one has to emphasize that for about, 7,500 or even 10,000 years, people were living in separate areas. Most of the Europeans did not travel to Africa, and they evolved separately, so to speak. So depending upon the region and which environment you grew up, varieties of traits have developed. And these symbols are, let me see if I can zoom in on, like lactose means ability to digest milk, skin pigmentation, ability to survive at high altitude, ability to survive in the Arctic, trypanosoma, that is an illness that has to do with sleeping sickness, which is, common in, Central Africa. It's a pretty serious illness, it can occur due to parasite and cause, multiple organ difficulties. And again, so there are certain genes that have benefited. So depending upon which region the population grew, okay, there are certain traits that have developed, because as evolution places the smallest advantage possible, so that gene is preserved as through generations. Because anything that is slightly beneficial, on the other hand, if a gene is harmful, that may be eliminated by natural selection. So these are varieties of this. Abbreviations are fairly technical, and we can actually Google each of these as to see what it does biochemically. But that gets, that would interest probably only Peter and John. So I'm not going to get into this, but I will send these slides out to as a separate to this. For example, some of these genes, AMYL, it has to do with called amylin, which is a little, enzyme in your saliva. And the same way, there are various genes that help you protect, survive on lack of oxygen. And I'll have individual slides for some of these, which are more common or are more interest to most of us. So I'll have individual slides without getting into the too many technicalities. And and there's a lot more details about the individual variants, which are in my notes, but I think, for sake of time, we are not going to. Okay. Now, again, why some of the recent analysis that has been proposed based on mitochondrial DNA, I showed this earlier as to how this, you can just see how the earliest origin was in Africa. So based on some of the mitochondrial DNA, they did not migrate out. So these are some of the African tribes that you can just see the names. I'm sorry. Okay, and starting from our common ancestors, Chimp, to various Bantu tribes, the San tribes. These are some of the earliest resident in Yoruba. These are various African tribes, and then moving on as time evolved, you can just see the further migration that took place until into the various other continents as the human migration took place. So non-African. So this is the gene tree that was based on the so-called mitochondrial DNA, which was inherited, as we mentioned earlier, from mothers onward. Okay.
Brad, Kevin has a
Yes.
question.
Yeah, please go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, bro, sorry to interrupt. There's a very well-funded organization that's part of Moffitt Cancer Center. Actually, Lee Moffitt started this organization called the George Edgecombe Society. And the objective of it is to try and figure out why this, even making allowances for access to health care and diet and economic status, why Blacks are susceptible to certain kinds of cancer way above what you would expect, particularly prostate, breast cancer, and cervical cancer. I just wanted to point that out. That it's an interesting organization. Actually, two olli members are on the board. Mike Bice, who's given lots of classes in healthcare, and Muriel Brathwaite, who's spent her whole career
I have slides coming up on that later on. Yeah,
okay.
I have the one for prostate cancer and hypertension. And for the medical aspect, as a physician, I was more interested in the differences between different ethnicity. I won't use the word race, but that there are half, and that's why I've been hoping that even if I have to go a little longer, I would try to record this, because that was, to me, that was more interesting subject. But this one really gets to be more esoteric and really doesn't have.
This is specifically race, not ethnicity, but
yes, exactly. So that's it. Yeah,
there's a big study going on between USF and University of Accra in Ghana. So
yeah, that is exactly about prostate. So I have the slide for that. So I'm glad you mentioned that. It's just there. Probably I think I'm about at 130 slide, and then it's at about 170 or something. So I recall. Thank you. Okay, and so this is, again, so now, since the word race is considered toxic, so we're just using the word human diversity. But basically, now on the other hand, there were, even before human genome analysis and before Crick and Watson, there were other geneticists who were the so-called classic geneticists, anthropologists, And the big name for that was an interesting name, Luigi Luca Cavalli Sforza. So he was Italian, and he worked on, I think, Berkeley or Stanford. Okay, and he lived to be, he had a long career, starting from, he lived to be 98 and just 96 and just died recently in 2018. So you can see his career span a number of years, and he had done some of the earlier work for anthropology in various Native American and Arctic area tribes, and then he was, again, he was totally opposite of some of the other geneticists named Louis Agassiz that I've mentioned in earlier classes, who was strongly racist and believed in the superiority of Caucasian population. So, but he was this Cavalli Sforza was not racist, and he had written several academic as well as popular books based on, say, but there is no such thing as race, and he had correlated something called cultural anthropology field. Okay, so based on linguistic analysis, anthropology, origin, and he had, and then with the availability of earlier of genetic studies, which was done based on migration of the DNA, the technique before the next generation sequencing became available, he had done studies on the genetic flow amongst various populations. So he had correlated all the multidisciplinary, the anthropology, DNA analysis, language, and culture, trying to establish whether there were real differences or how the variants were there, were proposed. And at the same time, some of you may be aware of that there was a Nobel laureate in physics named Shockley, who was got his Nobel Prize for discovering transistors back in 1952 or 53, I think, and when he had moved to West Coast, he was a strong believer in eugenics. And back in the 70s, Cavalli Sforza and Shockley had a debate, and obviously, Shockley's ideas were totally off the wall, and in just plain English, they were wrong. And again, back in the 60s, he had done studies based on blood types of various small indigenous group which were living in isolation, because there was, it was very hard to do studies on large population such as Africans or Europeans, but it was easier to study a smaller indigenous population that had lived in isolation, such as Eskimos, Pygmies, people on Andaman Islands, hunter colonies in South America. And so this was based on this. He had studies varieties of groups, and this again just confirmed the idea that there were a lot of, we were all identical basically, and there were not much differences. And then afterwards, they had proposed something called the Human Diversity Project, but this was back in the 90s, and compared to the 60s, the politics of population studies or culture and identity had changed dramatically. So again, so even though they were well-meaning scientists, they met with a lot of opposition from people who were supporting of indigenous rights. And again, so, and they had to come with the reality that, we're well-meaning scientists, but at the same time, this is not going to fly too well. So they met with a lot of opposition. And eventually, some of these projects never really got off the ground. But at the same time, now with the more easier genomic analysis, the database is being expanded, and the largest work is by the Chinese, and some of the European consortiums are doing a lot of work on collecting data on largest, smaller populations and collecting something called the Word Diversity Genome Project. Okay, and this was an interesting thing, that this is an article that was proposed, as the word Caucasian. Okay, so it's like basically, how it is equivalent to, the word has become totally, in 89, Oxford Dictionary noted that the term Caucasian had been practically discarded. so to speak. I don't know, maybe they say I'm wrong in this one, okay. And again, we talked about how the skin color does not met with the ancestral origin of the people, because the Japanese were very light skinned, but not Caucasian. In the same way, North Indians may be Caucasian, but not necessarily white. And the Hispanics, half of them considered themselves to be Caucasian. So this was really, the whole issue was muddled, and the terminology was coined by Frederick Blumenbach that we talked about in the first class. Okay, and so this is so we have gone over that in a full circle, and this is what the more recent genome analysis of human migration, or this is the slide from David Reich's book that we talked about earlier, that Kevin had pointed who we are and how we got there, so to speak. And he has a big, powerful lab at Harvard of population genetics, and they've done a lot of the work, and including the work has continued into the why African Americans get more prostate cancer, and some diseases are more common in some ethnic population. So this was the basic idea, that the pastoral migration from the Central Asian steppe region took place into Europe, and that's how the peopling of Europe and Indian subcontinent took place about 8,000 years ago. So you can just see from here the Yamanya culture, the so-called Beaker culture people, traveled and almost replaced all the people who had migrated from the so-called Middle East, And in the southern Europe, some of the admixture continued, but a lot of the migration that took place from Central Asia, that had a lot to do with the European skin tones and the gene flow. So they did the various analysis from various West European groups that all of the Southern Europe European people had inherited a small percentage of African ancestry due to earlier migration from Africa, okay, with a mixture about 55 generations ago, okay, the North African flow. And then again, the people from this, in the old terminology that was used, was called Levantine group. So there was about 5 or 6%, about 30 generations ago, okay. And so there are varieties of admixture that had taken place, okay. And similarly, that showed about the migration that took place into the Indian subcontinent among the North and South Indians. And that's how they had labeled this as ancestral North Indians and ancestral South Indians. As to see the percentage, you can see based on the circles that are there as to at what year, that before the current era, that migration took place, 3,300 years ago, before the current era. And so this is, was the latest analysis based on whole genome analysis of various ethnic groups. Okay, and again, these are some of the more detailed analysis, with the genetic variation. You can just see that, how these are based on the so-called ALU groups on the human genealogy, as to how the further you are from Africa, the migrations took place. And this puts this a proper time sequence on the migration that took place amongst varieties of African tribe, ancestral tribes, to varieties of pygmies getting wrecked. And these are the distances that are based on the small segments of DNA that have been that have been preserved, how that took place. Similarly, you can just see the other same thing magnified here, that the European migration occurred much later. And this is, based on the continent, they've been able to classify as to how these variation. The blue are the European, the red are the Asian, so to speak, and the green are the African. So this is the broad classification that have come. And obviously, Americas are much later. And these are fairly recent papers from respected geneticists out of Utah as to how the whole genome analysis has been beneficial in putting some number on how the migration of human race took place. And again, this has been useful to a small extent, because even though we say that we're all identical, there are small variant differences that have taken place. For example, a gene called AGT, which is called angiotensin, which has to do with your blood pressure control on the glands next on top of your kidneys, which has to do with something called the renin-angiotensin system. So when the variants occur, one of the variants that have occurred in some population, which has a risk of increasing hypertension. So this variant has a frequency of as high as 90% in some African population, but it's only about 30% in European population. So the studying this variant differences as clinical significance, it's not just academic exercise, but it's of value in terms of health and so-called personalized care. Let's give you another example. It's a gene which is, ignore the name, CYP2D6, which encodes a member of an enzyme called cytochrome P450, which is involved in metabolism of many important drugs. And even before genome analysis, in the medical school, I think the physicians amongst you will recall that this was studied, that if you have abnormality of this particular gene, you would not metabolize certain drugs, either you are so-called fast metabolizers or slow metabolizers, or even just it has impact on how you metabolize codeine, simple pain pills. So whether the same dose of morphine would be good enough for you or not. So this varies, this abnormalities varies from 6% in Asian population, only 7% in African population, to 26% in European population. So the dosage may be different depending upon who you are. So it does become clinically relevant. So the variant analysis, and again, this has bearing on clinicians. Okay. And these are again more examples of the genomic grouping. So this does the same thing with different graphics. Okay, as to how sorry, escape. Okay, so this had the classification that took place as to how the migration took place over a period of time, and how they had collected samples from different parts of the world, to see. So this is fairly powerful studies, that took place, as to so before all the mixing, the idea was that people were living separately for a huge number of years, like thousands of years. So there were, while on one hand we can say this race is social construct, these differences, the small genetic differences, did have effect on health and disease. Okay, similarly, the height differences that are there between northern and southern Europe. Multiple sclerosis is more common in European Americans rather than African Americans, and the end stage kidney disease is more common, amongst African American population. So these are, and similarly, some of these findings have been leveraged to find risk factors for prostate cancer, which occurs about 1.7 times more in African American population, self-identified African American population, as opposed to self-identified European Americans. So I think that's part of the stuff that Kevin was bringing it up earlier. Similarly, some of the other analysis that was done for various variants as to how to metabolize certain drugs. As you can see, some of these drugs you may not be, but this is one of the antiviral drugs. Carbamazepine is a drug which is used for in neurology. When you get a pain called trigeminal neuralgia, how that drug is metabolized. This is of particular interest, clopidogrel, which is widely used for, it was a brand name you may recall from ads in the past. It's called Plavix. After you've had a heart attack, you get something called antiplatelet drug to make sure that the angioplasty does not clot up again. So how you are fast or slow metabolizers. Simvastatin, which is your cholesterol lowering medication. Succinylcholine is used for anesthesia, okay, and how that is metabolized based on warfarin is the blood thinner which was discovered at University of Wisconsin as to people who are, and I've seen this before all this genetic became available. I had patients, I was giving like average doses 5 to 10 milligram. I had patients who could not thin their blood even after 20 milligrams. And I was, worrying I'm going to cause them to bleed to death, because obviously the blood, we used to check blood thinner once a week, basically at the most. And people were getting tired. Why do I have to keep coming back? You're still not thin enough. So that was, but now it just came to reason that yes, they have the metabolic abnormalities. Obviously, that knowledge wasn't there in the early 80s and 90s, as to how. And this was interesting that 23andMe, before the FDA got on their case and said, no, you're practicing medicine without license, so to speak. They gave me I was one of the earlier adopters for 23andMe, and they gave me data, said, yep, I'm either a slow or fast metabolizer for this and that drug. So some of the, even though they only do very small percentage of your entire genome, only about 2% or less, this was easy because it was very easy to isolate this particular group of genetic code. So they were able to tell me as to how I would metabolize certain drugs. So it's interesting information as to how easy it was to make this. And so this would have a huge impact on what would come to be known as personalized medicine. Okay, so how, okay, and again, these are some of the genes that you may recognize, the BRCA gene. And so this, as to how the certain genes are, frequency of this variant. Now, again, this, how we talked about the peopling of Europe, and I'm sure some of you are very familiar with this, was found in Britain and just caused a shock waves, when based on his DNA analysis, they were able to create a model as to what he looked like. And this is what the Cheddar Man was, skeleton was discovered way back, and then more recently, the genomic analysis was done based on his bone fragment DNA sampling. And this is how the artist and the scientist model was created. This is what he looked like. And when this was published in UK, as one of the earliest inhabitants of Britain, who lived there about 10,000 years ago in lily white Somerset. Okay, so that caused the shock wave, to us to, and it changed the thinking as to how, on one hand, he had blue eyes, but these were his skin tones. And the Natural History Museum of UK has a whole, like a 40-minute, video on it, for those of you who are interested. And this explained the wave of anatomically modern human migration, that he was part of the original migration that took place out of Middle East, and his ancestors would have left Africa, moved through the Middle East, headed west into Europe before traversing. Because in the earlier days, Britain was connected, to the mainland Europe with an area that anthropologists and archaeologists call it Doggerland, Doggerland, land bridge. And so this was 10% of the genome of modern white British comes from the population, which was anatomically modern humans. And so this was his Y-DNA belonged to a group, was haplogroup I-12, which was, in males in this, it exists, but a very small amount. So it was discovered. And again, so they've been able to do all sorts of DNA analysis based on modern thinking. Okay. And a lot of the work on the mitochondrial DNA was done by a geneticist named Brian Sykes from Oxford. Okay. And with the availability of PCR. So this was the earliest, the whole idea of white Britain was, really challenged to a dramatic extent, and shows as to how science can change our preconceived notions. This was another thing. I think we're reaching up to 11 o'clock. I think if people want to take a 5 minutes break, I think I would be opposed, or we can stop for 5 minutes. I'm sorry, I just realized it's 11:05. I can pause for 5 minutes and then we can continue. I think we are running. I should be able to finish at least just a few minutes after 3. Okay. If you want to pause the recording, and then we can continue in 5 minutes.
Right, you mind if
That thing. So, okay, thank you, Mr. Carlson. Okay, now this is another skeleton that was of interest, that I'm sure all of you remember the discovery of the Iceman, type of thing. So again, so based on his analysis, it was done that he was also dark skinned,
Brat,
I
again, you're not sharing
Oh,
it.
I'm sorry. Yeah,
No,
share.
no, we saw
Yeah,
him
I stopped.
before, so I know he's there somewhere.
Okay, he's back to you.
Yeah, there we
He's
go.
back. Okay, share screen too. Thank you, because it was just, yeah. So this was his skeleton, and it was very well preserved in the cold ice type thing. So I think if Peter had continued his mountain climbing, he may have discovered it. So I think he just missed out on the chance of making history. And so this was again and this was an article that was fairly recent article from the Guardian, and again it's amazing the amount of details and information they were able to fathom from this. The receding hairline, dark skin, okay, study reveals, and not only that, they were able to analyze his X that he was carrying that was made of copper, and what parasites he had. He had like a tapeworm type of bug. They were able to determine his paternal haplogroup. So he originated from somewhere in South Corsica and from related to Anatolian farmers. Okay. And, I think, and at least, even though, I've never been to Italy, he shares something with me because this blows my mind. He had H. pylori, the little bug that causes you to get stomach ulcer and heartburn. H. pylori strain. It was found in his gastrointestinal tract. Okay, and that strain was HP Asia 2. So strain that is now found primarily in South Asia and Central Asian population. So how he got that bug, living in Europe, had never been to South Asia, I'm sure, or Central Asia, but the bug did travel. So obviously the global trade had caused him to get the H. pylori infection somewhere along the line. So how the microbes had traveled. So how interconnected we are to the microbe. That is just absolutely fascinating to me that they were able to do the H. pylori strain and do the analyze that strain as to where it originated from a thousands of years old skeleton. So it was just, and they're able to see what type of food he had eaten. So some of the analysis that was done on him was just very, very sophisticated and very thorough, I think. Now we spent a whole lot second day lecture on skin tones and skin color and the pigmentation. And just for revision, we talked about the ultraviolet compromise as to how the essential of folic acid and vitamin D was essential for reproduction. And that's why there is a trade-off that took place. But again, these are varieties of genes that have been associated. And when the mutation takes place, it has to do with various amino acids in your body and receptors, which are coated by this particular gene. And so, and again, so if there is abnormalities of this, then the skin pigmentation can change. So these are some of the examples that are more of interest to the science nerd type thing. And this is again one of the genes that provide instruction for the skin changes in melanocytes, which we mentioned in the earlier, which causes the pigment and gives the color. So this is, so all of this is related to the genes. And again, there are some abnormalities that can take place, which are rare, but again, occur even in Africa. Okay. So this is rather rare, called oculocutaneous albinism, means you're just absolutely plain white on one hand. You may look obviously with curly hair of African ancestry, but you could be totally, and this could be pretty, it could be discriminated against dramatically type of thing. So 1 in 200,000 is rare, occurs. And you can just see that in Somalia, anybody who looks different is considered, is picked upon, so to speak, so they were pelted with stone. This is so this is common almost worldwide. Okay, and they discovered that there is abnormality in a sodium channel gene. As to how that ties in, we are not going to get too much into it type of thing. So it depends upon the sodium potassium interchange, which has to do with how the cells mature type of thing. So the biochemical mechanism is, but it's complex and is above our pay scale for this discussion. But again, so you can just see how the one gene abnormalities, which has to do with your salt exchange, has a long-ranging effect on causing changes in your cell line and causing external manifestations. Okay, and you can just see this from these pictures as to how different these kids would look. And obviously, they would have difficulty tolerating and just getting out in the sun. And again, some more examples, you can just see how, the changes can take place. So, okay. And again, there are certain other mutations, which once we started walking on 2 feet, there are some genes that we lost our ability, and so this is where it became naked ape, as we talked about. And the benefit of that was walking on 2 feet. And, again, it was when we started walking on 2 feet, and we developed the ability to sweat. So these are some of the mutations which are again related to the genes. And some of the abnormalities that takes place, you can just see, we talked in the first class, we talked about the underlying skin of the chimps, which is more pinkish, but covered with hair. Losing hair was beneficial, so to speak, that, bipedalism evolved at the same time. And it could be, so major characteristics of humans separating from bipedalism, basically being hairless, and then in the cooperation that developed at the same time, okay, and holding on to the baby with 2 hands, okay, the abilities developed. So these are again related to the one particular gene which had a huge effect, and these are varieties of example, as you can just see, orangutan on this side, as opposed to skywalking chimpanzees, okay. Other monkeys, snub-nosed monkeys. Okay, let's see what else we have here. And obviously humans type of thing. So, okay. Okay, and now these mutations have taken place, and not just in African, but even in small islands, of Melanesia. So this is about as far from Africa as you can see, Solomon Islands, which are in the northwest coast of Africa. And when Europeans first encountered blonde-haired people there, they just thought, oh, this must be, people who are, the Portuguese sailors must have had, fathered these children type of thing. But again, they were totally wrong, that this was genetically totally different. When the genetic analysis was done, you can see how the mutation developed separately. Highest prevalence outside the Europe. Okay, so you can just see how, so evolution, and is fascinating in this sense. Okay, so it just breaks down the so-called idea of race and appearance that you might have. The simple notions that you have are, so the diversity and the so-called gradient rather than sharp demarcation that takes place. And so this was all identified due to single gene variants in hair color. It's again, the name is of academic importance, that tyrosine P1 gene. Okay, so again, so this it shows the relationship between your genetic code and your phenotype or external appearance. Similarly, chemistry of kinky hair. Okay, you can just see that the chemical bond in the protein called keratin, which is in your skin, it changes. The links have a lot to do with how your hair would become kinky. You can just see how, example, straight hair, wavy hair, curly hair. So different ways our follicles would grow. And again, these are, genetics and hair color. So we, and we already talked about the melanin. So I should have skipped this slide. Sorry about that. Okay. And this is again the more biochemistry, which I think except for John, I don't think most of us would not want to get into this, but this is the complex pathway that takes place, So I think if you want to know more about it, talk to the 2 biochemist people in the group. But just tone it for their interest that this is how the whole thing works. But I'm not going to get into this in too much detail because people would sign off right away. So, okay. And so this is again, more example, environment, phenotype, genotype, the mutation of one amino acid. And you can just see how this is shown in the mouse also. So it just goes through all across you know, species. And again, as the environment changed in certain mice that were in Southeast United States, as the environment changed, their skin pigment changed. There's something called deer mice in Southeast United States. When they moved around in 6,000 years, the pigmentation, the mutation changed. So on one hand, evolution is not that we think it's very slow and insidious, but in relatively small time. And I give you the example of the group of scientists who observed the finches on Galapagos Island, that after 10 years, they were able to see the origin of an entirely new species that developed. So so evolution can be a lot more fast, depending upon the climate. And the classic example that people have is the butterflies during the industrial era, where this changed their, color of the butterflies changed. And again, in the curly hair and the dominant gene, as you can see how the hair shape changes because of mutation. As to the curly hair, it becomes more dominant. So the varieties of degrees of curl were sampled in South Africa, and from high curl to low curl, from A to B. So you can just see how A to B, and changing the direction of the curl contributes to the. So varieties of hair shapes can take place from wavy, curly to outright kinky. And I don't know if I mentioned that last night, but just last time, but the same way United States, the one blood rule, the South Africa during the apartheid era had something called the pencil rule. Okay, so I'm sure if the pencil does not fall off, then then you're black, so to speak. So that was the so-called pencil test, during the apartheid era. Okay. Okay, so I think we've talked about some of the other genes type of thing. Okay, and it's a very complex trait involving multiple genes type of thing. Okay, and this is of historical purpose. A guy named Henry Moss experienced depigmentation at age 38. It extended, this goes back, the 18th century, so to speak. And he wrote Henry's name as famous as, and this was the earliest medical evidence, this is in the modern era, so to speak, depigmentation that took place. So just thought this was of historical interest to people who are interested in appearance, so this is one of your, and even in the Egyptian papyrus, Eberis papyrus from 2000 before the current era, it has been mentioned. It has been mentioned in the Indian Ayurveda classics. So this depigmentation changes are, well documented in mankind in different regions. Another example is a not genetic but autoimmune disease, vitiligo, patchy but can be severe. Again, many genes can be involved, and classic example is, you recognize him obviously. The skin pigment, independently evolved over different states. Mike obviously had a lot of other plastic surgery, but this was, one of the things. And this was quite common when growing up in India. This was uncommon. One of my uncles had this, and he was in the British Uganda. And interestingly, he had entire vitiligo, depigmentation all along. So he was not questioned getting into the whites only clubs. Okay, so it just goes to show how the disease influence. When he wanted to go and have a drink, his skin tones were not questioned. So this was back in the 1930s that I remember him telling me stories when okay. Now this again, this is going to shock you type of thing as to, okay. So this was one of the thoughts that was given as to hypertension, okay, where this was the so-called salt hypothesis, Now, I'm sure a lot of you have not seen this picture. This is, it's such a gross and offensive picture. And how is this, well-dressed Englishman licking the African slave to make sure whether he was making a good deal type of thing. So theoretically, we're trying to test the salt in their sweat, so to speak. Okay, and so this came across this picture as to how this. Wow. Okay, yeah. So this was, and this is, you can find it easily type thing. So I just came across this, and I thought it was worthwhile. Okay, so salt retention, and the idea that was proposed was the so-called there's a lot of people during the transport across the Atlantic, they were like a 20% mortality type of thing. So those who survived had a better ability to survive the tough voyage that took place, and about the dehydration, the lack of water, and the heat, so they genetic higher sodium retention mechanism. And some people are associating that the current hypertension that we see, which is much more prevalent in African Americans, is related to because they had something called the founder effect related to this, that their inheritance, they were selected out by natural selection type thing. So how true that is, so that was, again, like the sweat ability was, and there were a lot of false beliefs, that was there in the early medical era, that yes, that they are able to stand the heat much more than obviously the Irish who were sent as a contract labor, or even Native Americans, and as we talked about in the first class as to how the Pope had said, no, they're humans, so we can't use them as slaves. So, but the Africans were okay. So that's how, but the sweating abilities, but that was all myth type thing as to just their skin color does not have direct relationship with your ability to sweat. It has to do with your exposure to temperature during the first few years. So the idea that blacks have a higher tolerance so they can survive the heat better, that was obviously a myth and erroneous belief type of thing. So, and again, that continued even in the industrial era, that they when people with the great northern migrations, the southern Africans were given the toughest job, that they can tolerate the foundry work, during the Ford factories type of thing. So when we did the class on cars, that's what they were given the hardest jobs. Oh yeah, they are able to tolerate, but obviously they had as much incidence of getting heat stroke as the others, depending upon the earlier exposure. So those were some of the ideas that were carried out, type thing. And this is out of curiosity, and this is a relatively easy change that was able to single gene related type of thing. So 23andMe had thrown in as a fringe benefit that yes, you have dry earwax. How that is useful to me, that is anybody's guess. But this was one of the findings that they had thrown out, along with some other more useful information, type of thing. Earwax comes in two types, wet and dry. The wet predominates Africa, and dry form predominates amongst East stations. Populations of Southern and Central Asia, roughly half and half. Okay, but I think if my memory serves correctly, they said I had dry earwax. Okay, so this was one of those things. So this was again, they found correlation with body odor was correlated type of thing. So tend to sweat less and have little less body odor. So this was again some of the fringe benefit that 23andMe, and there is when we did the class on senses, and smell. There is a well-known institute in Pennsylvania called Monell Institute for Smell and Taste. And so they do a lot of this pioneer work on this type of thing. So again, so they've been doing a lot of the work on how earwax and various organic compounds are released in sweat and ability to smell. So they do a lot of the original work on this particular field. Okay. Again, now this is a rehash, but just some of the major medical diseases. We talked at length about sickle cell and cystic fibrosis, common in Northern Europeans. Again, why the genes, which is actually a deletion of a three-letter code, which is, that's why it's called 1568 deletion, that is responsible for a substantial number of cystic fibrosis. There are many genetic abnormalities that are related to cystic fibrosis, but that seems to be one of the more common ones, that a three-letter code is eliminated. Now, why that gene has been not eliminated by natural selection, that may have benefit for illnesses such as cholera or typhoid. So that's why the evolution presses on that, even though some people who have two copies can get deathly sick and die by the time they're 20s or 40s at the most. Okay, so there's a lot of research that is being done, but that's maybe one of the explanations why that particular gene has been not eliminated. And then there are varieties of other illnesses that are common in so-called founder effect of Afrikaners, because they had almost, really they married amongst each other. And porphyria, that is, there are many types of porphyria, which are the hemoglobin metabolism diseases that take place. And the classical theory would be that Dracula might have had porphyria. Okay, that's why he had the, bulging of the things and the so-called blood hunger for pigment. But obviously, nobody has been able to get a skeleton and DNA analysis on Count Dracula. So that remains a conjuncture at this stage, Okay, and there are varieties of other things. This is a rare skin disease that occurs in a small community of Amish. And we'll have a few more things to say about the Ashkenazi Jewish communities, Okay, and they're on one hand, we can say they're, highly intelligent and with selective mating. These are some of the rare diseases that are extremely uncommon in average wide-scale population, but their frequency is far higher in Ashkenazi Jewish population. So these are just, the names are, again, cystic. Dysautonomia, there is a rare type of anemia, which is like you don't make enough blood cells. These are the so-called glycogen storage disease. These are the varieties of lipids that take place. And this is obviously the prototype of this was Tay-Sachs disease, which is again abnormality of fat metabolism, okay, and has a lot to do with. And I mentioned last time, that the voluntary organization, okay, Dor Yeshorim, back since the late 80s, had done self-screening before you get married or date, and if you have the abnormalities, then you should either go with adoption or in vitro fertilization. So that effort has been highly successful in eliminating, Tay-Sachs disease in the Gnostic Jewish community. So it's an exemplary work as to how genetic counseling and self-screening, and yes, to pardon the word, reproductive responsibility has a lot to do with it. Bruce, go ahead, please. Yeah, you can jump in.
Why hasn't there been any studies in the Sephardic Jewish communities? And has there been any comparison of genes between Ashkenazic and Sephardic communities?
I couldn't find anything. I would have to look it up, type thing as to why they haven't, because maybe it's not that common type of thing. Otherwise, I'm sure, that knowing the resources and knowing how smart they are, that would have shown, because, like maybe it was a relatively smaller group type thing. But I just amongst all the readings, I haven't come across that, type of thing. So, but I will definitely look into that type of thing as to why there is not much data. Maybe it's just not that common. That's why, So I'm sure people would have seen, type of thing, because just like, when the disease manifests, they would easily know what their ancestry is, type of thing. So, but perhaps it's not that common, but I cannot answer your question with references type of thing, but I will definitely look into that type of thing. Sorry. Yeah, but my guess is that it's not that common. That's perhaps why, because maybe they're more widespread and they married more outside their community. There was a lot more interbreeding because once they, so that was perhaps the only explanation I can think of, that if you dilute that out to one in 100,000 worse.
Barat, I would think just the opposite, that Sephardic Jews would more likely be insular and not marry outside, considering the environments that they were in the different parts of the world they were in. More anti-Semitic in the Middle East or Latin America than.
I'll give you an assignment while I'm talking. Just do a Google search, Tay-Sachs disease in Sephardic Jews. Okay, just enter a Google search, like Tay-Sachs disease in Sephardic Jewish community. Okay, so see if we can come. I mean, I'm curious. I'm glad I never thought about it, type of thing, because obviously I'm not Jewish. It didn't even enter my brain to look for it, because everything that I've read from all along, like even through medical school and along says, oh yeah, this is much more common in Ashkenazi Jews, but either they were not worth studying, or people study who are available. Maybe more Ashkenazi Jews were in Europe, so they were easier to study. I mean, that could be. I mean, they're not going to go around getting blood samples in Iraq or Iran, okay, or type of thing, or Indian Jewish community type of thing. So, or Ethiopia, so it's like, a lot of the data that was collected was on a community that was at hand. Okay, I mean, I'm just guessing, but maybe, because if you have to collect the data from what is available, the population that is easier to study. Like, for example, if you start doing research in Europe on a selective population, it's easier to study gypsies rather than go all the way to Antarctica. Okay, so I think that may be how the data collection might have, maybe it is there, but nobody has bothered looking. I mean, as that's another possible thought, that occurs. Okay, sorry about that, but I will definitely start working on it. Okay, and this is again a lot more complicated. We talked about cystic fibrosis, so like how certain communities that have grown that have lived in isolation, how common that is in a Faroe Island, I mean that. So like so again, like if you marry the wrong person, like you can have a serious thing. In Dominican Republic, it's fairly high, and so this is again to do with your sodium metabolism and the sweat, so their secretions are fairly thick, and that's why you may recall how cystic fibrosis people, their parents have to get on their back and make sure that their phlegm does not gets out of the lung, And now there are varieties of good treatment that are available, that and that has, so you can just see how the majority of things, it's a Caucasian disease, one can say, type thing, and it's extremely rare in so-called, Native Americans or Hispanic or other population. So that's one of the genes, that has been a bane or curse of, Northern European population. Again, now I think we talked about, this is the lactose gene that evolved different times in different regions, so to speak. There is a lactose dehydrogenase enzyme that is encoded by LCT gene, which is, again, what chromosome that is on, that's academic. It's expressed in your small intestine lining, and it helps you digest, because usually evolutionary wise, once you start eating regular food, there is no need to have the ability to digest breast milk. So that's why a lot of the populations, this gene has been eliminated. That's why the people in China and part of these sub-Saharan Africa, they they cannot metabolize dairy products. That's why you do not see dairy products in part of Chinese cuisine. Okay, but with the pastoral culture, this the beneficial gene evolved, that people who were whose ancestry was pastoral, they maintain the ability to digest milk. And obviously there is evolutionary advantage. Milk is quite nutritious, and so that's one of the reasons why this gene was not eliminated in the population that were cattle herders. Okay, so this was so ability to digest milk was clearly beneficial evolutionary wise. So that's one of the reasons. So this gene has evolved in Africa, and the gene that has evolved in the Maasai is different than the gene abnormalities that had evolved in South Asia. So this is again, evolution at work, as we saw. Okay. Again, let's see what we have. So again, so this is again to explain to you more lactose gene. How the frequency of varieties of these are the varieties of abnormalities that take place. Again, with what letter is abnormal amongst the 3 billion letters type of thing. So as to how different regions have, even amongst Africa, the abnormalities are subtly different. As you can see, the same gene, the coding is different from one letter to the other, so to speak. So this is been highly localized and narrowed down as to what abnormalities that took place in Northern Europe versus Northern India type of thing. So you can see the same gene, but the variation is totally different. Okay, another interesting thing, this is the so-called abnormalities that the genes how affect this thing, as to how the East Asians, once they don't have the gene to metabolize alcohol. So after it turns into aldehyde, and they get something called the Asian flush. Okay, you can see how just after drinking alcohol, faulty version of the enzyme. Okay, so defective gene causes this sort of one from each parent. Okay, you can just see the liver makes a faulty version of the enzyme, so they cannot tolerate. Okay, and again, I'm not going to get into the this part type thing, because we may not have enough time type thing. So okay, and again, now living on high altitude, and the first slide that I showed you, that complicated slide with the little icons of the word map, so that talks about how ability to survive at higher altitude. Okay, that again, there are varieties of areas where people have lived at extreme altitude, including Tibet and Andean mountains. Okay, and again, the ability to survive on a relatively low oxygen evolved in different parts due to different regions. Okay, say Andeans. Okay, there's different genetic abnormalities evolved compared to Tibetans. Okay, as to how they have higher hemoglobin, more red blood cells, and bigger chest, while Tibetans are able to pant more, and they are able to metabolize in spite of low oxygen, they're able to maintain the oxygenation. So there are different genes which have to do with oxygen sensing abilities that place. Similarly, Ethiopians develop different abnormalities. And the nitrous oxide actually dilates your blood vessels and creates more capillaries. So this is, and in some regions, like it had evolved later on. And some of these are obviously inherited in the same areas. And so again, so people from when they were building the Lhasa rail, okay, at the high altitude, when they were digging tunnels, people from the low-lying area of China were sent to Tibet to work. But obviously they had to give them oxygen while they actually were doing welding. Okay, so you can imagine how difficult it was to build. So again, because so obviously you could get, and this is one of the things about the mountain climber amongst us can easily tell that as to how you can develop, your lungs can fill up with water dramatically if you're not able to, so if you are not gifted, your lungs would fill up with water very quickly, and you could get something called high altitude pulmonary edema very quickly. Okay, so this is, obviously, the BBC has resources, they get around the world. Okay, and so they're able to tolerate lack of oxygen, underwater. So they are literally sea nomads. And the reason for that is they've developed a larger spleen. Okay, as to it was, not sure as to what it was, but when they did the genomic analysis, the natural selection of one gene variant have increased the spleen size with a larger reservoir of oxygenated red blood. Okay, so there is a selection bias that takes place, about the affecting the diving reflex. So it just, and obviously, they have not been there for billions of years. So you can see how the genetic advantage, and their environment and the genes collaborated to give them, to maintain the lifestyle which is, okay. Now, at the same time, there are moving on to continental US. This is one of some of the dark chapters of medical science, history, race, time, and the father of gynecology. The physicians amongst us would recognize, there is something called the sim speculum that you start using when you start doing internal vaginal examination. And so this was gynecologists, was started practicing in South and later had moved to Columbia. It was Dr. Sims. And on plantations in Montgomery, Alabama, at this time, obviously women had a lot of children and they had uterine prolapse, means their womb would slide down into their vagina. And he wanted to, obviously learn the technique of operation after difficult childbirth. So, so he wanted to, he operated on these people, without any type of anesthesia, even though at that time chloroform was being available at the time. And, obviously, he started using, a simple kitchen spoon to act as a tool to keep the vaginal orifice open, and obviously there was nothing like informed consent at that time. And so he continued to modify his technique of the so-called vesico-vaginal fistula, means there is a artificial communication that has taken place between the urinary bladder and the vagina. And so it took, obviously there was a learning curve. So he completed his technique finally and had opened a practice in New York City. And so finally, so it was again, finally some of this history became available very recently, so to speak. So, so this was the father of American gynecology, and this was Sims' textbook of gynecology. So, and the Sims speculum is used worldwide, so to speak. So, and these were the names of all these, the African American slaves, were, well summarized in a recent book written about the history of medical racism that I've read. Okay. Okay, and so and a lot of the studies are done. Basically, racism is still, the nose shapes is being classified. Is alive and well in medicine. So, and again, not just in between whites and blacks, but even in India alone. How the North Indian and South Indian nose has been classified as to how different regions. You can just see that this was I just stumbled upon this as to how the nose shape varies between the North and South Indians, the appearance, and again, there are varieties based on appearance, varieties of anatomical terms have been devised, the variation in skin types. And so this is, again, a limit, done in women living in North America of Indian ancestry and how it's been classified. Okay. and again, this was, so after David Reich's work from studying samples from all over the world, they took substantial number of samples and said, okay, although we can say that, yes, we believe that origin is still Africa, we can just classify based on ethnic diversity or population, isolation that they've grown, as you can say, roughly at 5 groups, So again, one can say that this circle, we are coming to a full circle based on the findings as to Africa, Europe, Asia. So you can narrow down if somebody are given a full genome analysis and then in comparative analysis, the people who are the bioinformatics people, they can roughly tell as to which region this person's origin may have come as to majority of parts. So this was, shortly after the human genome analysis was published. So the science and the technology has advanced far enough to be able to narrow down in a broad terms, whether that is significant or not, that remains to be seen. And again, so like when we get back further enough, this is again not to contradict the point that we made throughout the class as to how if you go further back, you can just see that your number of ancestors would increase exponentially. So if you go back far enough in time, you would have huge number of ancestors. So we could be all related one with the other, where we talked about as to how we could all be related to King Charles or Genghis Khan. Okay. So, and these are the variety of regions. This is just a repeat of the slide that we talked about earlier. Okay. And again, so the mixing and complexity, so no one population is actually pure type of thing. Okay. And again, when 23andMe analyzed the data, the people who are self-identified African Americans, and only 70% of they were Africans. The 25% was admixture with European community, with European ancestry, and 8% with Native Americans. Okay, so Latinos had 65% European, 18% Native American, 6% Africans. So again, and even amongst the self-identified European Americans, and there was admixture that they had about 19% African ancestry. So when you get down to it, so, and again, we talked about how it still ethnicity is relevant as to how certain diseases are important, multiple sclerosis in Europeans, prostate cancer, West Africans, as we talked about. Okay, and phenylketonuria. Okay, again, this was interesting that we've all known about phenylketonuria, but I just thought I'll throw that in, that the abnormality of gene might have been, there may have been some benefit to fungal infections. So that was new to me type of thing, because it was the prototype of the earliest, single gene inheritance disease, as we talked about earlier. Okay, and so So we can find, so this will have relevant with health and so-called personalized medicine. Okay. Sorry. Okay. And again, so there are now some of you who are more into health and heart be related. There is a gene called ApoE, which has a lot to do with, it's been in the news for Alzheimer's disease. Okay, and has to do with your chances of getting early coronary artery disease. So ApoE gene has a strong widespread effect, on your health, and survival type and cognition. So again, so there are the variations of this abnormalities that can take place, in various populations based on, and on one hand, this is a risk factor for cognitive decline that takes place. Okay, but again, it has benefit for survival type of thing. So they're more likely to have more children, so to speak. So that's why the genes are not eliminated by natural selection, Okay. And so this was done in very isolated population that people did study, in a small, hunter-gatherer tribes in Bolivia. And this was a combined effort from UCLA and the Bolivian natives. So they had to almost take, the brain scanning machines and set them up in rural Bolivia to do the study. So this was really a dramatic study as to how there's a benefit in survival and fertility. So this was some dramatic work as to combining modern neuroscience, genetics, and isolated populations. And similarly, Mexico has started doing their own effort of creating Mexican biobank as to how, the native Central American natives who had, lived in isolation for thousands of years. So they're collecting data, and that might have bearing on, let's see what, okay. So that has the abnormalities on their liver metabolism type thing. So people are collecting data on various ethnic minorities, and those were not previously studied as well. Okay, and we talked about, how founder effect deeds, and we already talked about this at time. Similarly, amongst in India, there is a lot of endogamy, means marrying amongst a small caste or tribe, whatever you want to call it. Okay, so so this was, and before that, the word caste is actually a Portuguese origin of casta. Okay, that has to do with race, but the order's classical Sanskrit terminology was something called varna, means skin color. Okay, type of thing. So that's how this classification. But this was due to selective breeding. A small groups have an enzyme abnormalities that they can react badly to anesthesia. Okay, that usually an extremely rare complication that can occur after general anesthesia, that you get hyperpyrexia, your temperature goes up dramatically high, and you could almost be fatal. It's fortunately it's rare, but so this is very common in this small community of a small subsect of Brahmins in East India. Okay, due to endogamy. So this is how genetics can come back to haunt you, so to speak, depending upon your intermarriage. Okay, so that is so right, and again this was another slide. This is again from David Reich as to how founder effect is even stronger than Ashkenazi Jews because of continued. Okay, say how this is the enzyme that we talked about. This is cholinesterase enzyme as to how you metabolize an anesthetic agent, and so this is about as strength of founder effect event. So this was a slide that I was referred to earlier as to how common this abnormalities can be. So this is again a simple variant can come back and have a potentially lethal effect type thing. So, and again, this again blew my mind as to how a genetic abnormality with your dopamine gives you with more adventure as to how migration has been related. So how your genes can come back and affect how whether you're going to leave your old place and migrate or not, type of thing or not. So, and so there are certain stressors, so this is like you're looking for novelty and excitement, so to speak. So this is related to your pattern. So, and again, the other dark picture, along with SIM study that was talked about, that I'm sure most of you have heard somebody periphery about this, the Tuskegee study that was done by the United States Public Health Service, working with Tuskegee Institute, began a study as far back as 1932, natural history of syphilis, okay, and untreated males, okay. And even though penicillin was available, they did not offer it to the treatment as a choice. And it was only recently in 1972 that an enterprising AP Press reporter was looking through some of the data, okay, and came about this, how they study, and it came to the general knowledge as to how. And again, during the after and subsequently, obviously, the government apologized, and the last of the survivors have finally died, type thing. So this was, and not only just that, okay, a syphilis infection study was carried out. This is after penicillin by the U.S. government in Guatemala between 1946 and 48. About 1,000 people were engaged in experiments. Uninformed Guatemalan consist were intentionally infected with bacteria, so that can cause sexually transmitted disease, okay, type thing. So this was, another sort of a dark chapter in the history of public health. and not to be outdone, the colonial government of British Army, they exposed, the Indian Army, recruits to mustard gas during the war without giving them adequate mask protection or other stuff, to study the effect of chemical warfare. Okay, so the saga of so-called research is quite tainted, to put it mildly, I think. But it's just, a shocking text to have. And again, right now the availability of resources, that this is just, and some of the criteria that were codified based on relatively small number of studies that were taken, what, like there is something called the glomerular filtration rate, okay, which is a way to estimate your kidney function based on the amount of your creatinine in your blood urea nitrogen. And all throughout, until very recently, there was an equation that was used to calculate this, how efficient your kidneys are, and there was applied something called the race correction that was applied, type of thing. But knowing that what we just talked about, how the racial mixture is testing, the numbers were, based on a relatively small data. This data, that the equation that was derived based on so-called clinical observation was based on relatively small studies in the 30s, and that was carried on through medical textbooks until very recently. Why is that important? Because based on the estimation of your kidney function, okay, either you are placed on transplant list or not on transplant list. So knowing it or unknowingly, we, the medical or nephrologist community may have rejected quite a few people who would have otherwise qualified to be enlisted on. And so some of the book that has been written about by various African-American women about how this inherent racism was hardwired, and these are some of the references, you can just see that these are fairly recent references from prestigious medical journals. Okay, and similarly, the lung function correction was also applied for African Americans and patients. And again, that was based on a very low or poorly collected data type of thing. Okay, and so again, that osteoporosis, obviously there is a difference type of thing depending upon who you are. Okay, breast cancer, type of thing. And so again, when this gets into, and I mentioned briefly about Dr. Charles Drew, that how the blood was segregated until as recently as Second World War. And Dr. Charles Drew, who was African American, who was the head of the Red Cross in Washington, D.C. area. Okay, and again, finally trying to segregate the blood that was sent to the soldiers who were fighting in Britain for, during the Second World War. So finally, that segregation policy was, he resigned based on that. Okay, that he just was, and somewhere along the line later during the thing that was the requirement was removed. Okay, and this was some of the propaganda that the Nazis were using, type of thing. So And this is again the varieties of blood group. In my other class, somebody asked, Arthur, can you tell the race based on blood groups? No, you cannot. This was some of the earliest work that was done in 1930s, before genetics classification became available. But there is no way to tell based on certain groups are more common in Europeans and Asians type of thing. But again, there is a big, various gradations that takes place, type of thing. Okay. And again, there is another red blood group. It is called rhesus blood group. Again, if you have a mismatch during childbirth, your baby of the newborn can have a severe blood abnormalities, and the blood can be destroyed with hemolysis. So again, the distribution, is all across the board. So it's just based on skin tones alone, but cannot tell how they so one just has to do the blood test for it. Okay, all right, moving right along. And this is the thing about which we talked about. No, there is another thing more than blood group. A more complicated thing is called HLA. This is called antigen that is on your white blood cells. And these are thousands and thousands of antigens that are there on your red blood cells that helps you protect against immunity. And that is body's way of fighting the infection. And as if you are getting for transplant, it is much more advisable to get as much HLA compatibility as you can get, type of thing. And based on donors, it becomes a difficult issue that there are far fewer donors who are of African American ancestry. So the chances of getting perfect match is far less amongst African American or Asian communities than amongst average self-identified white population. So again, this is this type of typing, the HLA typing. There are differences that are still clinically very relevant, so to speak. Okay, I think we're just over. And this is again, any book that you talk about medicine and race, this was, I think, as a cardiologist, I'm well aware of this particular drug, that this was heavily marketed, that two particular drugs were considered to be more effective. They expand your blood vessels and lower your blood pressure. So these were considered, and these were traditional drugs. But somebody, one of the pharmaceuticals, along with the researcher, decided to market it as a combination pill, only useful for African American population, based on a relatively small data from the Veterans Cooperative Study, the vasodilator type of thing. And they said, okay, well, this would be a nice money-making venture. And these drugs were over-the-counter generic drugs, okay, which dilate blood vessels. They've been around for almost several decades. And so this was considered as a quote-unquote special drug. But obviously this was not, it was a big more of a financial way of marketing drug rather than, okay, all right. And again, so this is, BMI and race, as to how the identity of the criteria were defined based on, just the appearance and the data that was created, type of thing. Okay, what is the average person, and the different types of fat, as to how, as we very well know, the African body build is different than an average white person. And part of it may be has to do with heat loss. Became curious as to why African Americans have women have bigger bottoms versus start this thing. So I just looked that up, and some of the thoughts that are there that may be due to having a bigger surface area and having more heat loss. So evolutionary wise, there may be some mechanism that occurring, type thing. And again, there's recently a book, an African American scholar named Sabrina Strings wrote a book called Fearing the Black Body, the Racial Origin of Fat Phobia, as to how, it's considered, what may be normal for. Okay, Bruce, did you have a question? I'm sorry.
No, I'm waiting for you to get to the end. I did that
Oh,
Google search.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'll just have 3 or more slides. I think we should be, I'm moving right along. So, okay. All right. So this is, again, the varieties of race cannot be used to predict heart disease, so this is the more finally thinking that, again, with the admixture, we are hard pressed to say that to diagnose who has a propensity of early heart disease versus not, that thing. So, and again, now this is most recently, somebody mentioned at the other class, that during COVID, the fingertip oximeter was not able to accurately diagnose, the oxygen level in African American population. So, and even the Apple Watch had difficulty with picking up the correct amount of data based on the sensors type of thing. So again, so the appearance had huge bearing on health and disease. Last but not the least, various based on the HLA abnormality, which we just talked about, certain abnormalities have a high relationship, amongst African American population with a disease called ankylosing spondylitis. Okay, and various other diseases are involved as well. It's 3 times less common amongst blacks than in whites. Okay, type of thing. So, and this was well known even in, I graduated, long, several decades ago. But this was taught in our medical textbooks, that human leukocyte antigen abnormality, which does not exist among African blacks, but it's much more common in European population. Okay, so this antigen abnormalities that's in the blood cells have a lot to do with, and some of the other Asians have some abnormalities also, but that gets into a lot more technical and for sake of time. And again, immune response. This is the stuff that we were talking about. As David Rice talks about, prostate cancer gene in African American men played a role in growing appreciation as to chronic inflammation that is driven by immune mechanism and causes cancer progression that takes place and has a huge impact on the higher incidence of prostate cancer. So on one hand, the immune response may have been beneficial against specific pathogens or preventing you from getting sick during childbearing age, but it later on comes to haunt you by causing the same immune response or lack thereof has a higher incidence of causing cancers. So nature gives you one way but takes it away the other way, so to speak. Immune response, race, and cancer. So this is probably how you can just see how the cycle just gone. Endogenous pathogens, selective pressure, okay, optimize innate immune response, migration, and non-ancestral environment. So the same response that evolved over thousands of years comes back to haunt you, so to speak, because initially evolution just scares you to survive to enough to have enough kids. But after all, what happens to that we talked about in the class on health and disease about falling off the evolutionary cliff. And again, we talked about the ApoE gene, so I think I will wrap that up. And again, this will have some of this variant determination will have a huge effect. Okay, and in terms of how this was an interesting paper that I can't get too much into it type of thing as to how some of the salt restriction advice that is given for for blood pressure. The standard advice that is given restrict your salt intake to 2 grams per day. Okay, all right. So this is but the consumption that is evolutionary occurred. Some of the ancestors of African Americans, there was lack of salt in West Africa, so to speak. So they were able to survive on 200 milligrams of salt. Okay, so this is the standard advice that is given to all patients, does not apply very well. So how you metabolize salt, this thing amongst African Americans, that has a huge impact as to what is considered normal salt intake versus non-normal intake type of thing. So again, personalized medicine has a huge this thing. Okay, this is my last slide. Okay, all right. These are the famous quote from a well-known celebrity, personality, politician. Okay, who said this?
Donald Trump.
Yeah,
Yeah, orange dude.
Yeah, so this is this was his thing. So and again, not only that, when he was campaigning in Minnesota, he does through the Minnesota is largely white population. You have good genes, that you're right. Okay, and a lot of it is all about genes. So the racehorse theory, okay, so you have good genes in Minnesota, and I'm sure the Jewish reporters in that crowd must have been cringing. Okay, so I think we'll stop that. End of slideshow. Thank you for sticking around for a few minutes. We can stop. I'll stop screen sharing. Okay, Bruce, please
So I
was-
just
I was-
threw out into Google Tay-Sachs disease,
And
ended up on a Wikipedia page,
mhm,
and there was a chart on the diseases that Ashkenazic Jews, separate chart for Sephardic Jews, and another chart for Mizrahi Jews, which were the Oriental Jews.
right, I'm familiar with it.
Okay, and there's a whole bunch of diseases. You're going to understand what they are, Barat. I don't, but
Oh,
it
yeah.
definitely seems like what countries they came from and the chances of how many in that population, like 1 out of 6 or 1 out of 4 would have a certain disease. So
Okay, so
You
who was highest? Ashkenazis were highest on the top for numbers.
I'm sorry, what?
Okay, so which particular group was high for Tay-Sachs disease? Actually, I don't. You can. I think you can try to share the screen if you want to. You can share the screen if you still have the page open.
Yeah, I still have the page open.
Yeah.
Let's see. You have to unshare so I can share.
Oh yeah. I've stopped it. I've stopped seeing screen share. Yeah.
And let's see if I can share. Here it is.
Oh yeah, it's coming. I think it. Oh yeah, thank you. This game. Oh, this is great. Yeah.
The study looks like the people who did it like back in 2009, so it's obviously out of date. But and then look at
But
all
still,
these things for Ashkenazic Jews.
Oh yeah. So this is
Yeah.
So there's yeah, these are so many of these are very, very rare actually in general population type thing. So okay, but again, so these are some of the names that we can say that this the lipid storage disease, the glycogen storage disease, that may have indirect benefit to intelligence. That was the hypothesis that the MIT paper talked about. Okay, and
I mean, and this is the
this is the
Sephardic.
Middle Eastern. Yeah, I see the classification. Okay, yeah, that goes along type of thing. So yeah,
And then there's the Mizrahi, the Oriental Jews.
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So they have different, different things to worry about.
But yeah, there should be links at the bottom. Yeah, I'll look into it. Yeah, this is very interesting type of thing as to how, because it's like, and I may have mentioned that my dad was a police prosecutor in India, and we have a police inspector. His name was Isaac Erulkar. So he was an Indian Jewish person, I think. So.
Well, that whole thing was that there were supposedly rabbis from the Middle East that would do the Silk Route all the way over to China, and as they went along and stopped at different places, had sex with different women and just kept going. So there was a deposit of Jewish genes along the route.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So, yeah. So, thank you. That's very educational. Thanks for looking it up. Yeah, I think I think you may have to leave, but I think I'm reading a book about the Jewish businessmen who were running all the banks. That is just a new book that I just found from library that I'll talk about it. Type of thing.
Well, that goes back to what you said earlier about, what were the influences for Jews, Ashkenazic Jews, like good at business? Well, they got forced into that.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and there was something else that you mentioned that they got forced into. They got forced into communities. They didn't own land. They were urban because they didn't get to own land. So it's not like they. The culture forced them into certain things.
Yeah,
wasn't done on their own.
Yeah, right. I think, and this talks about how many of we were in South, and this may shock you, but some of the Jewish businessmen were slave owners in South.
Very few, but yes.
Yeah. It's I was shocked out here. Say, oh wow, that is shocking type thing. But then finally, some people realize, okay, this is enough. So we're not going to live in the South. We'll go back to New York. I just started reading the book. It's just gave the.
What's the name of the book?
I have to get it for you, and I think I'll just give me a second. I'll get it.
Okay. Hey Peter, it's too bad his library isn't big enough, right? He's got spaces on his bookshelf back there.
Yeah, I think he borrows a lot of books, and he's one of those honest people who bring them back.
Okay,
The Money Kings.
The
Okay.
Money Kings. Yeah, this just came out, type thing. It talks about the founders of the big Lehman Brothers, Seligman Brothers, and how they were, and then Goldman Sachs, Loeb Kuhn. Okay, so all the bankers who were taking on to Morgan and other people. So how they started out with absolutely nothing, and then went on to found, so it's just a fascinating study as to how they were, okay, like.
Yeah,
and
supposedly Hamilton had a Jewish mother.
So it's an interesting book. I think, it's a long book, but it's going to take me a while to finish, but I think I will work on it, type of thing. So this is in my.
Well, the same way you breeze through medical stuff, I can breeze through financial stuff, and it's like, oh yeah, I got that, and just keep going, right?
Yeah. No, but this is like a personal story as to how, how they got into, stuffing. They supplied, uniforms during the Civil War, and and then again, that's, oh yeah, they were worth $1 million by the time 1865 came along.
Oh, speaking of which, you'll appreciate this. Have you been to I don't know if you got over to the James Museum in the last month or last couple months when
No.
they had an exhibit on the Chinese in the West and their history out of Western America. And there was the guy who did the tour told a story about, there was one Chinese guy who was a laundry guy, and he got to be very, very rich. And they said, well, how could you make so much money in the laundry business? And he said, well, there was all that gold dust that was in the clothes of the miners, and it fell out and it accumulated, and I used it to buy lots of. So he took, the opportunity was there. He saw it,
Wow.
etc. It's just a matter of where's the opportunity,
Yeah,
and
that is interesting. Yeah, that's far out. Yeah.
it's
It was fun.